I got a really great comment recently listing 10 things that hoof trimmers often disagree on, and I thought it would just be helpful to go through each of them one by one. These are really important topics and they have nuance in the answers and, you know, varying by situation. So I just thought it would be a great opportunity to go deeper into hoof trimming ideas and just really think critically about it. The first out of the 10 points are bring the heel weight bearing surface back to the widest point of the frog. So this is something that is really commonly done and kind of widely taught. I have an opinion where sometimes it is the right thing to do and sometimes it is not the right thing to do. This is something you're going to hear me say a lot throughout this video. With hoof trimming, every horse is unique, every hoof is unique, and there's very few absolutes in hoof trimming, things that you do every single time no matter what. There are so many exceptions to every rule that you can barely even call them a rule. You just kind of have to look at all the options of what you can do and make an educated decision based on what signs the hoof is giving you. So in this case in particular, in a very healthy hoof with, you know, a good heel angle, a good toe angle, not a contracted heel with a wide, robust frog and a nice thick sole, yes, you would bring the heels down to so that the weight-bearing surface is at the widest point of the frog, meaning the back of the frog and the back of the heels are all lined up with each other and they are on the ground. Now, when this could be really detrimental to a horse is if you've got a horse with a very low heel angle or the heels are contracted. In these situations, the heel, like the widest part of the, not the widest part of the heel, the widest point of the frog is often really far back behind the heels, and if you were to take off all the hoof material to get it down that low, you would be cutting way into the sole, you'd be cutting way too much off, and that horse is going to be sore. I'm going to use my cadavers here as an example, but on this hoof, you can see the widest point of the frog is in line with the back of the heels. Now this hoof is a little bit distorted because when it dried it kind of shrunk together a little bit, but this is an example of, you know, a time when those are in line. But sometimes this widest point of the frog right here is way like up here behind where the heels are, and in that case if you were to take enough heel material down to get them in line with that back of the frog, I mean, the horse would be crippled. You might even hit blood. It would be really not a good thing to do. So for this first thing, again, sometimes it's right, sometimes it's really not right. So that's why it's really important to read the hoof. Going on to number 2, it is trim so that the quarters are off the ground a little more than the heels or the toe area. Now, I really like this one because it is referencing the wild horses. If you've ever studied or looked at pictures of horses' feet in the wild that have never been touched, but they just have the most perfect feet, you will often notice a little quarter arch. I'll show again on here. This is actually a wild horse that was brought into captivity and was never really tamed down. So he partially wore his heel down, but I would say they definitely, not heel, he partially wore his hoof down, but not completely as perfectly as they do in the wild because he wasn't moving, you know, 20, 30 miles a day, although he did live in a big rocky pasture. And you can see here, there is a little bit of a quarter arch here. So these are the quarters. If you need a brush up on anatomy, it's the heels, the quarters, and the toe. So you can see there's, if the foot was flat on the ground, there'd be a little gap where the quarter is. And that in hoof trimming terms is called a quarter arch. So some trimmers will put a quarter arch in there to emulate that of the wild hoof. Now, personally, I only do this in very rare circumstances, and I'll tell you what those circumstances are. But first, I'm going to tell you why I don't do it very often. And that is because when you manufacture that there, where it's not developed naturally by the horse moving and on what kind of terrain that horse is moving on, because that's the thing about these wild horses. You can look at feral or wild horses from all over the world, and their feet are going to be completely different because they adapt to the terrain that they are in and the conditions that they're in. So there's not one kind of hoof that's perfect for every horse or every living place. So that's why I don't manufacture that onto there as in force the quarter arch to be there, because it kind of puts the horse, if you think about it, onto 4 corners, the toe and then the heels, because you've got a gap there, instead of equal weight bearing surface along the whole hoof wall. Now, if you have a horse that you say trail ride a lot and you don't put boots on it because its feet are nice and tough and you really barely have to trim it because it wears its feet down on its own and those develop, don't trim them out because they developed for that horse. But I just don't do that on purpose in my trimming, except, I'll get to the exception now, if there is a quarter crack, so a vertical split up the hoof where the quarter is. This can happen sometimes. It happened to my own horse, and I've actually made a lot of videos showing how I corrected it, and I used a quarter arch to correct it. So I'll link those videos in the description. I did a whole series on it. But the thought there is, and I only did it on the side with the crack, when there is a crack in the hoof, anytime that hoof wall gets long and is hitting into the ground, the pressure of the hoof wall hitting the ground is driving that crack farther and farther apart. So you kind of want to relieve the pressure of the hoof wall there, make that part of the hoof wall not weight bearing, so that when the hoof hits the ground, it's not causing that crack to split farther and farther up the hoof. So I'll use a quarter arch to grow out a quarter crack, so that I can grow that crack out without it continuing to split. So that is a great tool, the quarter arch, to use in that situation, but is definitely not something I do on every hoof that I trim. All right, number 3 here, carving out the sole and the frog. So if you watch my channel, you know I am definitely all the time saying, do not carve the sole, do not carve the sole. But I'm gonna get into a little more based on anatomy and biomechanics, why you don't do that, and why it can be detrimental. And also when you would trim the sole, because there are some times when you do, you just have to know how to read the hoof properly. And I often say on this channel, don't ever touch the sole, because I know there's a lot of just horse owners who are trying to get into hoof trimming who watch my channel, and it's kind of one of those things where you're gonna do less harm by leaving it on when you should take it off than taking it off when you shouldn't. So as a safety precaution, when I recommend when people are learning to trim, just don't touch the sole, because it's just really gonna give you that safety net. So until you can learn a lot more about internal anatomy and hoof mapping and really get deeper into that, it's just safer not to touch it. So that's why I say that on here, even though you may see in some of my videos where I'm trimming where I do take some sole material out. So I'm gonna get a little more into this because I think it's a great opportunity too. So again, I'm going to reference the wild horses here, and they often have a really beautiful concave sole. That's a desirable thing in the barefoot trimming world, to have that nice concave sole. So by that, what I mean is that inside the sole, it's like a bowl upside down. It's concave like that. But that's not something you can force to be like that. Like, take a horse that has a flat sole and carve it to be concave. Again, really gonna sore that horse up and lame it. And I'm gonna really explain why here. So I'm gonna use my other handy cadaver here. Inside the hoof, I have this one is cut exactly in half. This is the frog here. And then these are the coffin bone and all the internal structures of the hoof. So in order for the hoof to be concave, these bones need to be high enough up, and the live tissues underneath them are then high enough up. Ideally, the top of this coffin bone should line up right with the hairline here, which it does in this hoof, which is really great. And this horse does have concavity in its sole. But what can happen through so many different hoof issues is the bony column sinks down. And so the top of this bone is actually much lower than the hairline. And there's different ways you could say it. You could say the hairline is raised up. You could say the hoof sank. Really, it's all meaning the same thing. It means that the bones are closer to the ground and that there is less sole material here. So through proper hoof trimming and getting that horse doing a healthy heel first landing, which is proper biomechanics. If a horse is doing a toe first landing, that's going to cause a chain reaction of a lot of other issues. But that heel first landing is what, over time and healthy trimming, is what's gonna develop this back of the hoof really nicely and help these internal structures get back into the proper positioning. And once these internal structures are back in the proper positioning, that hoof is gonna get concave all on its own. So then when would I know to trim the sole, and what are some clues you can look for to know if it's safe or not? One, if the sole is coming off in big chunks, say with your hoof pick, that sole is shedding and ready to come out. If the sole is really chalky and loose, and again, you can just scrape it out with your hoof pick, that's a sign it's ready to come out. Another really important clue here, which I'll make a separate video on how to do this in better lighting. I'm here, it's dark out, I'm not even out with the horses, but I wanted to go over this because I thought it was really important. So you can kind of get your own x-ray vision by measuring the sole depth and the thickness of the sole by the collateral grooves. Because all those internal structures I showed you here, they're above the top of the collateral groove. So if there's very shallow collateral grooves, then you likely have a very thin sole. So I'll make another video sometime soon teaching exactly how to measure collateral groove depth, but that's just a little intro to that, and why really carving out the sole is something that you really want to not do. Because again, it's gonna also back up your progress. If you make your horse sore and by carving out the sole, the horse is gonna go to a toe first landing and just exacerbate the problem of not having a concave sole. So let's move on to the next one. Back up the toe by trimming inside the white line. I really like this one too. These are so many great topics. And again, this is one on my channel. If you've watched my videos a lot, I'm always saying, don't trim into the white line. Don't trim behind the white line. And this is one of those things where that is another rule, like don't carve out the sole, where I actually do that sometimes when I'm trimming. Not that I carve out the sole, but I will trim sole. And I do trim behind the white line in some of my trims. But as, again, my viewers learning to trim, it's just a good rule of thumb to prevent the horse from getting sore by accidentally trimming too much. The times when I do trim behind the white line is when I have mapped out the hoof and I can see that there is no live material behind the white line. So this cadaver is going to be a great example for that. It's in circumstances with horses with really long toes, or when you look at the bottom of the hoof, the frog should take up at least 2/3. So the frog is 2/3, and then there's like 1/3 in front of the frog, or it could be more. But if you're getting to where the frog is like only halfway, half the surface of the foot, that's a way too much toe in front, and that's a situation where you would want to trim behind that white line. And I actually have another video planned specifically about trimming horses with those super run forward toes. And I'm going to go into detail of measuring the hoof and how to do that and how to know how safe, how far back it is safe to trim. But for right now, I'll just say, yes, sometimes I do trim behind the white line, but it's not something I recommend people do. And it's definitely not something you do in every case. In an optimally healthy hoof, you don't trim behind the white line. It's more when the hoof has some distortions and you're working on correcting them, primarily under run heels and run forward toe. That's when you're going to trim behind that white line. But generally, and in every horse, definitely that's not something that I do. Number 5 is hoof angle and toe length don't matter anymore. Now, I do partially agree on the hoof angle thing. When I'm trimming a hoof, I'm not trying to get the heel and toe angle to be exactly 55 degrees. There's a range, and every hoof is going to be a little different, and the hoof may not have perfect angles and still be very healthy. So I would say they do matter to an extent, but not to an extent of trying to force the hoof to hit a certain angle, meaning this angle of the heels and this angle of the toe. Now, ideally, they should be close to matching, and again, when you get into under run heel situations, that heel angle is going to be sloped way more than the toe angle. And that also leads into you go to the pasture and they can be broken forward or broken back. All these angles are very important, but again, I just don't try and put a horse and a hoof into a box of be this exact certain angle and I'm going to trim to force it to be that angle, because it's When you trim for a desired look, that's when you run into problems. You really want to trim for what that hoof needs, even if it's not maybe exactly looking ideal. As in, I'm gonna go back to, yes, if I carved out the sole, would it look nice? Yes, but it's not right for that horse. So again, reading the hoof, that's the biggest part about hoof trimming. But as for toe length and not mattering, to me, toe length is so important because the longer the toe you have, the longer the breakover. And when I say breakover, this is the hoof. I'm gonna try and do a little example here. Walking on the ground. The hoof steps forward, it lands, heel first, ideally, takes a step, and the breakover is how long it takes for the toe to break over, essentially. And the longer the toe, the more strain it's putting on all the tendon and ligaments in the leg. So the shorter the toe, the easier the hoof breaks over. So that's when people say a shorter breakover is equal to a shorter toe. So a shorter breakover and a shorter toe is one of the things where, again, when there is maybe issues in the legs, injuries there, such as, or navicular, arthritis, a shorter toe and a shorter breakover can really help the horse be more comfortable. Growing out certain hoof issues, you want a shorter breakover. If you're noticing bruising in the 10 to 2 o'clock position in the white line, that means that toe has been too long, breakover's too long, and it is causing bruising. Well, I will say that is one of the reasons it can cause that. You can also get bruising in the white line due to too much sugar and inflammation, so there's many things that can happen from many different causes, but definitely I go for a shorter breakover without taking the toe detrimentally short, like I was just talking about in the trimming inside the white line question. And if this is all seeming a bit much and a bit advanced, I actually just created my first mini course and I'm really excited about it. It's teaching very intro hoof trimming. It's for horse owners who just want to rasp in between professional trims. They don't want to take over all by themselves. I go over the basic anatomy you need to know without getting too into the weeds, all my rasping techniques, exactly what to do step by step, and you're gonna be able to maintain that bevel on your horse's hooves in between professional hoof trims. It's gonna prevent chips, cracks, it's gonna keep your boots fitting. There's so many amazing benefits to it, and just really leveling up your skill as a horse owner. So if you're interested in that, I'll put a link for it in the description of this video too, and you can learn more about everything that's inside the course and what you get with it. Number 6, I also really like this one. You have to map the hoof before you start cutting. I would say there is doing a full-blown hoof mapping where you draw on the hoof and you measure the angles. There's actually a great app for mapping the hooves if you want to, check your horse's progress. It does cost it does have a cost. I don't actually have it, but I have a client that uses it. And that can be helpful for hoof mapping if that's something you really want to learn about. But then there's also just reading the hoof and looking at clues from the hoof. So really depending on the situation, I'm going to balance somewhere in between that line. I'm not going to fully map the hoof every time I trim it. I will definitely read the hoof. The main 2 things I look for when I go to trim a hoof are the collateral groove depth, which I mentioned before, and I'm going to teach you how to measure that. You want to measure it not only at the back, but also towards the toe, because those can be very different and indicate a rotated coffin bone. And then, like I'd also mentioned, the ratio of frog to hoof. And there's many other things to look at too. You're looking at if you put a grid over the hoof, if it was balanced or if there's more on one side or the other. So I think reading the hoof is essential every time you're going to do a trim, but I do not think it's necessary to do a full hoof mapping before you trim each time. And that's just me. If that's something you want to do, there's absolutely no harm in doing that. But me going out to trim 10 horses in a day, I'm not going to map 40 hooves. But again, obviously I'm not going to go in there and just start cutting without paying attention to what the hoof is telling me. So it's all a balance. 7. Whew, it's getting hot by this fire. The horse needs expensive supplements to grow a decent hoof. So I 100% agree. You need to feed a high quality, balanced vitamin and mineral supplement, and also get the sugars in check. That's also goes in line with that. You can feed all the right vitamins and minerals, and if there's too much sugars, you're still going to have a lot of problem in the hooves. And I would say yes, often this is not super cheap, but just because a supplement is expensive does not mean it's good. So this is where I really recommended a naturally sourced supplement and a supplement that is balanced ratios. Certain vitamins and minerals need to be balanced at certain amounts because of they share receptors for absorption. So you could actually be feeding enough of two minerals, say copper and iron and zinc. I'll give those three all go together. And you could be getting the sufficient amount per day to your horse, but if there is a lot of excess of one, it could take up all the receptors and the horse wouldn't get enough of the other ones. And if this is something you're interested in, I have a free ebook all on diet, nutrition, hoof health. I'll also put a link for that in the description, and that goes into that in a lot more detail. But yes, I am a huge component of, really having a great nutritional plan for your horse. You can do the perfect hoof trim, and if the diet's not right, you're gonna run into so many problems, and you can't fix that just through trimming. And you also can't fix hooves just through diet without the proper trimming. They go hand in hand. They need to work together. But again, it probably will not be the cheapest supplement, but just because it's expensive doesn't mean you should just buy it and feed it. Really research the ingredient label. But yes, I definitely agree with this, that supplements, so important. Number 8, what to do with the bars. For this one, I'll just go over like the general, what you should do with the bars, and then certain circumstances where, again, you don't do the same thing every time. So the bars are here on the side. In this hoof, they are a bit long and overgrown. Again, this hoof had never been trimmed, literally. But ideally, the bars should extend halfway down the frog. And the bars are kind of an extension of the hoof wall. You can see that really clearly here in this hoof. And they should be, just above the sole plane and not folding over or running out into the sole plane. Now, bars can be, or they are, a very supportive force inside the hoof. If a horse has very thick soles, the horse needs less bar to support. So say I am pulling shoes off a horse and this horse is thin-soled. I'm probably not going to trim the bars at all. I don't want to take any support out from underneath that horse in that situation. A few weeks down the line, once the horse is adjusting, maybe the horse is in boots, I'm going to take a little bit more to adjust the horse to that. But if you have a horse that gets sore easily, thin soles, you don't want to over trim those bars because the horse is probably using them for extra support. And even in a very healthy foot, I don't want to take them down to nothing. A mentor of mine once said about trimming bars specifically, it's about exfoliation, not excavation. So you do want to trim them, but you don't want to carve them all the way out. I just thought that was a great quote for bars. I still think about that all the time. Trim for a horse with chronic laminitis. I think this might have been in reference to the specific video. I'm not sure, but I'll just say the trim for a horse with chronic laminitis is of course going to be different than your standard trim. It's going to be one where you take the hoof wall down lower, and when there's laminitis, the hoof wall is being pulled apart. Instead of just at one crack, it's kind of being pulled all apart out this way instead of just in one spot. So that's where I trim the hoof wall shorter than I normally would and do a really strong bevel on there. And that's going to almost relieve the pressure off the hoof wall so it stops being pulled apart more. And then again with laminitis, it's a huge diet component. Diet is almost more important than trimming when it comes to laminitis, because that, if you don't control the sugar in the diet, it's just episodes are going to keep happening. But that's just a whole nother super long topic. The hoof walls should bear the weight of the horse, not the sole, the bars, and frog. So again, in certain circumstances, there's going to be more weight on that hoof wall. Again, a horse with more thin soles, you're going to take the hoof wall down and leave it about a 1/4 inch above the sole plane, because that sole cannot handle bearing as much weight. In a perfectly healthy, robust hoof with thick soles, the sole is 100% meant to bear weight, not all by itself, but it is a weight-bearing component, because when the hoof takes that step, this whole hoof capsule actually widens out, the frog lowers down. The frog should definitely have contact with the ground, because when that frog hits the ground, it's helping pump blood all throughout the foot and back up to the heart. This frog is like a blood pump, essentially, is the best way I can say it. There are so many veins and arteries running out through this whole hoof capsule. It looks just like a solid hoof, but there is like a whole network going on in there. So definitely, and in this part, it said the bars, I just covered the bars in number 8. The bars do help support the hoof, although they should not solely be doing it. So the whole hoof is supposed to work together, you know? It's not just one part of the hoof, it's bearing the whole weight. This is a big 1,000-pound animal. The whole hoof shares the job, and depending on the health of the sole and of the hoof is which parts of the hoof will do more of the job than others. So I hope this was a helpful video to everyone. I hope it was interesting. And if you want to let me know in the comments what your favorite part was or what you learned from it, I would love to hear from you.